see him clicking the stream on. So welcome to the second installment of our Digital Liberal Arts series. I've met everyone in this room for the benefit of the folks on the live stream. My name is Nigel Harstead. I'm the online learning and LMS specialist here at the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies at the University of Mary Washington. Long title. So thanks for joining us. Like I said, this is our second town hall event for the Digital Liberal Arts series. And today, as the cute kittens are telling you, we are focusing on the future of education. So last week we talked about the digital liberal arts and sciences and thinking about interdisciplinarity and how those concepts of working together in disciplines and the impact of the digital is really impacting what we do here. And today we're going to take that and move it a bit forward and start to think about a variety of different questions, which we'll put up here in a few minutes, to look at what are the next steps with our changing enrollment, changing student body, more quote-unquote non-traditional students. How does that impact us with the increased use of digital tools and the digital liberal arts and everything along those lines? So what do the liberal arts look like going forward? What do they look like at that intersection with the digital in particular? So the format here, we hope, will be cozy, will be really interactive. We're going to start by, like I said, we have some questions that we are just going to throw out there. And our panel up here, which is my colleagues from DTLT, we're just going to kind of start off with some comments, some remarks on those questions. And then we'll open it up for discussion. We hope that the majority of this will just be a sort of round table, or in this case, square table discussion with our attendees, where we can really start to talk about how we see this here at the University of Mary Washington impacting the future of what we do at this institution and at other liberal arts institutions. So with that, I think I'm going to first, I guess, introduce, for the sake of folks on the live stream, introduce the folks on our panel. I guess I should do that. So to my right, we have Jess Reingold, then our director, Jesse Stommel, Chris Schaffer, and Lee Scallert-Bissett. So in total, we comprise the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies here. So we'll just leave these questions up, and in rather bad form, I just have a wall of text on a slide, so forgive me for that. But these are just sort of the questions that we want to use as starting points today. We don't necessarily have to stick to them, but this is how we will be kind of framing some of our remarks, and then we'll have a conversation that moves from there. So with that, I'd like to invite Jess Reingold to start us off.
Okay, so the question that I was looking at is, what does the liberal arts experience look like for increasingly non-traditional students? So when I was an undergrad here at Mary Washington, I was actually a very traditional student. I lived on campus all 4 years. I completed in 4 years, never commuted, didn't have to worry about working. I did have one on-campus job, but that was it. However, I did have friends, and I do have friends that were commuters here and at other institutions. And basically their most common issue among them was that they don't feel like they have a home on campus. And that's just because they don't live here, and it's just they don't have a space where they can go in between classes that it's like their dorm room. It's a place where they hang out all the time. They have to find other places on campus and things like that. But then there's also other commuters, and these commuters were just living at home but coming here for school. They weren't really working a lot after school. But there are other commuters that also have full-time jobs and or families to take care of, who are also taking classes and commuting. And I can only imagine what that must be like. And that's something that definitely needs to be considered moving forward, especially with the future of education, because there are an increasing amount of these types of students, especially since colleges and tuition keep getting more expensive. A lot more students are going to have to work while they are taking classes. However, recently, even though I was a traditional undergraduate student, I applied for an online master's degree, and so I'm going to become a non-traditional student. I expect to work full-time. I want to stay here working as I complete that program. It's also an online program, so that's going to be another non-traditional aspect of that. I think because we are still trying to develop the best methods for creating and implementing online courses, I would still consider that still very non-traditional. And so students that are taking online courses, the online students are non-traditional students. So that's going to be a big shift just for me personally, but then I will have, I think, more of an insight into what it looks like to be a non-traditional student as well. And hopefully I can bring those experiences with me and talk about them with DTLT and how we can, help non-traditional students here at Mary Washington.
So I started teaching in 2001, and I started teaching out of a super traditional institution, University of Colorado Boulder. My students were college kids, in quotes, with almost a little halo above their heads, the college student hat that they wore. At the same time, in about 2007, I took a second job. I was one of those road warrior adjuncts for a big part of my career. I taught at 4 different institutions at one point, at 9 classes, adjuncting at various different institutions. And there was a period of my career where I was teaching both at University of Colorado Boulder and for the community college system in Colorado. And it was just two completely different worlds that I was teaching in. And for the community college students, I was teaching at an online community college. It was essentially the group that created online courses for the entire community college system of Colorado. It had its own mini campus. And I actually helped design courses that were taught by 50 sections of the courses that I designed were taught per term. So I was really thinking about teaching in a completely different way. I started doing that in 2007. That was my first experience teaching fully online. And I'll just be completely honest and say that I absolutely hated it, 100%. I could not stand teaching online. And I taught for 5 years, hating every bit of it. But I kept doing it. And the reason I kept doing it is because that entire period, my students kept me doing it because I felt like it was so important and so valuable to give them a space to have an education. And I saw so many of my colleagues teaching 9 classes, road warrior adjuncts at many different campuses, not having the time to really think through what online education was for these students. So almost every term, I would have a handful of students stationed in Iraq, and I would also have a handful of students that were mothers with 5 kids, or a really common group of students I had were mothers in rural areas who were 50 miles from the nearest institution. And so they had no other way to take college classes. And for them, it was really a point of empowerment to be able to do this. It felt like a way to think through what their life was going to be. And teaching these students was fascinating because the way that I thought about teaching had to completely change. So I taught, when I was teaching soldiers stationed in Iraq, my students would very often tell me, I'm going to be gone. I'm going to be deployed, and I'm not going to be back for 5 weeks. And I would have to say, okay, I'll hope to see you in 5 weeks. And the interesting thing was that I was teaching so many students that I always worried that someone would just not come back after the 5 weeks. And I would also have to be extraordinarily flexible in thinking about how I structured classes, not only so that I could adapt for those students, but so that that sort of adaptability was built into the course itself. And it's a far cry from the kind of online courses that we see offered at so many institutions, especially for-profit institutions, where the online courses are lock, stock, and barrel, where they're modules that are delivered and modules that are disseminated to a group of students. My students actually needed the adaptability. When I started in 2011 teaching at Marylhurst University, which was a liberal arts institution for non-traditional students, non-traditional adult students. Mostly it was degree completion students, people who had a community college degree and were working on finishing a bachelor's degree. And I launched for them a hybrid degree program, a hybrid online degree program. It was primarily online, and the students would come for 2 to 3 days every year, an intense 2 to 3 days where they would all work together. One of the things that was interesting that I remember from that is having my students, a number of students, actually in our first cohort, we had 3 students who were new mothers. And the new mothers wrote to us and said, I really want to enroll in this program, but I'm going to have to bring my baby to that 2 to 3 day intensive course. I'm breastfeeding. There's actually no way for me to leave my baby somewhere else. And, otherwise, if I can't bring my baby to class, I'm going to have to leave every 2 hours to go back to the hotel to breastfeed. And so it was an interesting thing, and to notice sort of how my institution responded to that. My institution charged me to create this hybrid degree program. And then I got into a lot of conflict with the institution because there was just a no babies ever policy. And so essentially that conversation forced the institution to think in new ways about how this institution was structured and how it was structured for particular kinds of students, but not for other kinds of students.
Yeah, I've had related experiences. I also taught at CU Boulder for the last 3 years, and before that at a small liberal arts university in South Carolina. And I've had, as a music faculty member, the programs are highly traditional. The students aren't always. But we have things like, as the music theory and RL skills professor, I would teach music theory Monday, Wednesday, and RL skills Tuesday, Thursday. And there was no flexibility around that. You had to be there 4 days a week for those core courses. Ensembles also multiple days a week. There wasn't a lot of flexibility, and there wasn't a lot of interest from the CU College of Music in expanding that to reach other students as majors. There was for non-majors, however, and so I taught some courses for the psych department or cross-listed with computer science and music that were very untraditional. Some were online, some were hybrid. And so it gave me an interesting perspective on how this worked with the students there. We had, I remember one student that I had was commuting from Colorado Springs to Boulder, which is about a 2-hour drive in good traffic. And so she had to cram her courses into 2 days a week so that she could work on the other days and not spend the entire week in her car. And so that meant that she had to do a one-on-one tutorial with me on Mondays and Wednesdays for her Tuesday, Thursday class, which technically was not allowed, but it was the only way she was going to be able to graduate in a reasonable amount of time. Or she'd come back for a 1 credit hour course for 2 semesters in order to make it work. So we worked around that, but that was not a tenable solution for a large number of students. We could only do that for 1 or 2 at a time. And so that was something that then when we moved and started seeing what online courses would do, it opened up access to those kinds of students who maybe couldn't be there Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. and could participate in some of these. In that case, they were courses for non-majors. We ran into the other side of the issue, though. When we opened access in terms of the course schedule, we realized that the technology was closing access in some other ways, right? So for example, flipping the classroom and using a lot of video content, or moving completely online where there's a lot of video content. It has bandwidth requirements. So my first job is a small university with not a lot of bandwidth and a lot of people on Netflix and playing games online in the evenings, and that meant low bandwidth in the dorms. Some of my commuter students only had dial-up at home or very slow DSL connections, so they couldn't just download a huge video and watch it. That constrained my pedagogical choices as to when I would use video, when I would use text. Ultimately, that led to me thinking more carefully about when I used what and made better teaching choices so that the videos were better and the text was better and they had more reasonable resources as a result, because it forced me to think carefully about it. But it was tough figuring that out, especially for the students who were then limited. One other online situation to bring up is the student I had last summer who was working in an internship that was supposed to be 40 hours a week and then taking 1 online course in the evenings as a relatively traditional undergraduate student with no encumbrances besides those 2 things, no family commitments. That seemed pretty doable until her internship turned into 60 to 65 hours a week. And now the 3 credit hour course that was accelerated into a 5-week program, which was taking 20 to 25 hours a week out of her, meant she was working 2 full-time jobs. It also meant that any video-based content for my music-based course that makes some noise when you make it was going to interfere with the sleep of her roommate because she wasn't able to start working on it till 11 p.m. And so, but these are situations where in a traditional course setting, a student will know, I can't make it at 8 a.m. 5 days a week, so I'm not going to sign up. An online student might say, this is going to be flexible. I can do this. I'm going to sign up. I'm going to pay that tuition, and then realize once the course starts, I don't have the bandwidth for this. Or the schedule is flexible, but the work that I need to do doesn't actually fit into my life situation. but the money's been paid and they're past the drop deadline. And so what do we do then? And that's something that I've realized as I've moved more of my courses online, that I've got to think very carefully about how am I closing access to students who think the access is open to them, and how can I reverse that so that I can actually make the course accessible to everyone who might want to take that course.
Yeah, I like those experiences because thinking about the experience of the student and what do the students need versus what do we think that we ought to give them. So for example, thinking about, and I'm guilty of this too, right? Thinking about the future of education, and I alluded to this, how the market or the demographics of our student population is starting to change toward more, working students, toward in some cases older students, people with job experience, et cetera. And, especially with online programs, it'll obviously be fewer residential for those programs that are focusing on online. Well, like Chris was alluding to and talking about, how does that change what they need? And when we start to think about the value of a degree in and of itself, I kind of question, are we offering a degree or are we offering an experience? And are the two different? When I first arrived here, I'd never been to a liberal arts institution, and I was open about that in my interview. I went to a state school, North Dakota State, and then University of Kentucky, where there was a lot of great instruction, but in some cases, there were some programs that were just meant to fill your brain with the prerequisite knowledge so you could go on to the next class. It was less about that liberal arts feel that we see here that I'm still kind of in awe about with the students and the whole approach. But when we start to look to the future, and especially right now, we see a wave of credentialing, and a year ago or so, and even now talking about badges, and then talking about continuing education and lifelong learning and certification, we start to talk about things that are separate from the degree, and in some cases, but hopefully not always, separate from that holistic four-year experience that we think of as a traditional liberal arts experience for a student. So that's a question that I've been grappling with here in my role, is how can we have that experience for programs that maybe are not targeting the traditional, quote-unquote, liberal arts student who's residential 4 years, taking it all in, campus activities included. One program that I really want to point out is our nursing program here, which I think is starting to do that. They're starting to look at more hybrid and online offerings, and we've had a lot of really great conversations about what that means to have this liberal arts experience in a professional program, especially one that, moving more and more courses online. And when we really drill down into it, yes, the experience may be taking place in other locations, but sometimes that gives you more opportunities that you maybe didn't have when you're sitting together in the same room. So, for example, one of the courses they're working on is empathy with your patients. That's how they're bringing the liberal arts experience, and one of the prerequisites is writing. And it's not so much the technical writing or being able to write for the nursing profession. Yes, they're teaching that. And if we think about a credential, yes, that is the certification that they are receiving to get promoted as a nurse or receive the next certification. But the flavor or the liberal arts element of that is that through that writing, we want them to learn, or our nursing program here wants them to learn confidence. They want them to learn empathy and the ability to connect through writing with their patients and with those families. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that goes on that I think there is a danger for us to say, oh, certifications and continuing education and badges necessarily mean that we are stripping that holistic liberal arts education away. And well, I think that's worthy to think about. It's also worthy to think about what can we still do within those constraints of smaller and smaller packages of education. One other example would be not here, but a previous program that was a historic preservation program, and one of their classes is literally bricklaying. Like, they go out into the field and they learn how to take care of certain types of stone. They learn how to identify it. They get their hands dirty. They actually build these replica historic fences. Well, how do you do that online? Well, especially with the new demographic of students they were targeting, because they were targeting working students who didn't have the time or the money to fly into their location and spend a month or two. They were going to be on the ground in their locations, online, asynchronous. So yes, there was a trade-off there, but so that they couldn't do the bricklaying and the really hands-on stuff. But what they could do was leverage the locations in which those students resided. So it was really interesting to start to think of those possibilities of, yes, we're doing continuing education, we're reaching a different demographic of students, the modality is forcing us to make some trade-offs, but what they were gaining was the ability for these students to bring the experience of and the uniqueness of their locality into the class. So when we think about, the value of the degree and these new ways of thinking about education as perhaps credentials or perhaps continuing education as something separate from what we do already as a regular liberal arts experience, I don't think they're all that far apart, and I'd be interested to talk more about that.
So what's interesting to me in terms of these buzzwords, and we've heard them, and they're in pop culture, our politicians are spouting them, journalists are saying them, and parents are coming up to us with them, and students even themselves are asking these kinds of questions. And we can debate the meaning of these words, the relevancy of these words, but one of the things I'm interested in, this is my background in literature speaking, is why are these words having such resonance with parents, they have resonance with parents, which is why the politicians are using them. Why are they resonating with them? Why are they resonating with the students? Why are these terms, why are these concepts, why are they what we are currently moving towards and holding on to, really? And a lot of the times, and I think we know this, but it's worth saying that, again, that there's a lot of fear. Right? We talk about the students lacking grit. I don't see that. Again, I come from, and that's something that's really common along this panel. I spent a lot of years teaching at a rural state college in one of the poorest areas in the country. And these students did not lack grit. It took grit to even get through the door of that institution. What they lacked were resources. And support, and may I say, empathy. Some empathy for what it is, and some understanding in somebody, that personal connection, to take the time to connect with these students. That the research shows, we know, is what these students need in order to succeed. They need the resources, they need the cultural capital, and they need to connect. And they need to connect with people on campus. And so my challenge, and what I think some of what we can struggle with, is how do we use these terms? How do we use this fear, not to exploit it the way some would have, and lots of for-profit have, and the like. They've exploited that fear, very real. But how can we then use it productively in order to connect with our students, in order to connect with the parents, in order to connect with potential students, and have that connection in order to help them through that 4-year or, unfortunately, 5-year experience that will get them the degree that they feel that they need in order to be successful. And so whenever I'm faced with these buzzwords, I try to very much listen to what's going on behind those buzzwords, to try and hear, and a lot of time it is fear, but to hear those kinds of emotions that are driving the kind of forcefulness that they come at us with these buzzwords, with these, you must change, you must adapt, you must innovate, or risk being left behind. And then the question is, well, why? What is it about it? And then also be able to learn from some of those experiences. Again, a lot of the research on for-profit is what they're finding is one of the reasons why something like for-profit is an attractive option is because they have completely lowered the barrier to entry. Right? You don't have an application fee. You don't have a long process. You can walk in, and a half an hour later, you're registered, you're a student, and you have a schedule. Right? And that is really convenient and a really opening way, as opposed to having to come up with X number of dollars for an application fee, trying to fill out the form, trying to get the FAFSA done, trying to get all of that stuff done on your own by a certain deadline with essays, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, there's this idea of, okay, what can we learn? Why have people been attracted to these particular forms of education that would run contrary to the values that we hold at a public liberal arts institution, right? Why are they going there and not here? Right? Those are also things, if we listen, if we pay attention, and we get beyond the kind of hype, I think we can really learn from it and use those lessons in ourselves, not to radically transform how we deliver education, but perhaps radically transform the way we see our students and radically transform the way we help our students move through this process and see the value in this process.
So at this point, what I'd like to do is open this up, because when I imagined this series, I really wanted it to be town hall style. So in a sense, us having a conversation. We've thrown some stuff at you in order to kind of seed that conversation, but ideally the rest of this wouldn't be you asking us questions, but it would be us having a conversation across tables. So does anyone want to jump in with a response to any of the things that you've heard in the last few minutes, or want to take a stab at one of those questions that are there? You've got a microphone on your table. There's also a back channel. If you use hashtag DOOO, you can jump in and put some comments out on the web as well. So thoughts?
And we invite you to use the microphones just because we are live streaming this.
Yeah.
And if you don't use the microphone, we can hear you, but nobody else can.
And if you don't use the microphone, you won't be famous on the web. But you already are, Steve, so don't you worry. You got to turn it on. Little switch.
Is that better? Yes. Lots to think about. It's probably a good thing that not a lot of faculty are here, because otherwise I might get in trouble. I think we need to think deeply and carefully about what a college education really is, especially at Mary Washington. I suspect that it's not the first thing that comes to our head is probably superficial and not real. I think faculty may need to think more flexibly about what their job entails. Just a simple example, if you're teaching online, being in my office from 11 to 12, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, probably isn't going to cut it in terms of being accessible to my students. Another thing about adult students in particular is if we expect that when our students need help, they will reach out to us, we may be missing a lot, especially for people without the cultural capital that we're hearing about, people that don't understand, people that may have this idea that going to talk to the teacher means you're in trouble or something like that. More and more, we have systems that will provide us with some information about which students are struggling. You know, so we may may need to think differently about what it is that we do with our teaching time. When Nigel was talking, when Nigel was talking and when Jesse was talking, one thing that struck me is that with some students, what we may need is variable term lengths rather than forcing it all into, the shoehorn of 14 weeks. What's sacrosanct about 14 weeks? Okay, traditionally in the BLS program, we don't really expect BLS students to finish in 8 semesters. It's quite normal for them to take 1 or 2 or 0 classes from one term to the next. Why couldn't we extend that to the term length, or maybe do away with the whole concept of a term in some programs? There was, let's see, I don't see it anymore. Is that the whole slide? Oh, redesign course structures. Yeah, our course structures, our whole curriculum is in a straitjacket of structures that we see generally as that's just the way it has to be, you know. And it doesn't, but there's a lot of history and a lot of habit that would get in the way of redesigning course structures. Just think of something as silly as being able to put another designation on a course listing on the registrar's page or something like that. I would argue that those things aren't fundamental to what we're trying to do. They're ancillary support systems, and we shouldn't let those support systems prevent us from doing a better job at what we're doing. And then one more little comment. It's not little, but it's different than the others. The flexibility that we build into programs to help our non-traditional students can also really help our traditional students complete their programs too. Okay, and we shouldn't forget that. So, you know, maybe that's a selling point at some point. So, thank you.
Wait, can you repeat your very first question again? Because I think I have thoughts about it, but I don't quite remember it.
I think I have thoughts about it too, so I'm just going to jump in since we're supposed to be having a discussion. So he talked about what we need to think about, what does a college education actually mean to people? And this is a conversation that I had with some of my friends probably when I was a freshman or a sophomore in college. And it was friends from back home, so we were all in different colleges at that point, and we were having a discussion one night, and someone said, well, what is college to you? And he proposed that to him, college is much more of accreditation rather than education. And I think that's something that we don't often think about, you know, as academics and as educators. We say, well, of course it's an education, but for many people, it's not. You know, I am privileged enough to come to college and say, yes, I'm here for an education. But I think especially for people who aren't as privileged, they are coming for accreditation because they need to go out into the world and they need to get a job and they have to see things that way. I refuse to see things that way, and that's one of the reasons why I haven't gone to grad school, because I think that grad school is purely for an accreditation purpose for what I want to do. But and I know Jess has some feelings about that as well because we've had discussions about it. But I think Steve's right. We really do need to think about what does education mean, and not just what does it mean to us, but what does it mean to our students? What does it mean to our prospective students who aren't even here yet, who don't know about Mary Washington yet? And how can we market ourselves, you know, and design our courses in ways that fits these different needs and different definitions of education?
One quick follow-up endorsement to what Leah said. A wise older faculty member a long time ago said something which shocked me at the time. He said, what we do as faculty really doesn't matter. What matters is what students learn.
Yeah, so building off of that, thinking about what does a college education look like, I think a lot of people, it falls into those two categories. It's an education or it's just for credits, and I want that degree, I want the piece of paper, that's it. And I've definitely had some friends who were actually commuter students who were going just to get the piece of paper. They, not all of them, but some of them were just going to their classes for their major. They had gotten their gen eds elsewhere at a community college, something like that, and they didn't really explore anything else. And one of my friends who was doing this actually asked me, they were like, well, how do you know so many people out of your discipline? And I'm like, how do you not? But it's because they weren't living there. They weren't going to other things. They didn't have time to go to extracurricular events because they were also working. So for me, a college education isn't even about just learning those academics or getting that degree. But for me, it was actually learning so much more. Because when you're here, especially if you are living here, and this is something that I think traditional students benefit from more than non-traditional students, is you're learning who you are, first of all, or learning more about yourself, which is an education that I'm, in of itself, I think. You're learning how to socialize with other people. It's very different from high school. There's hopefully a lot less drama. So you're learning how to adjust to that. You're learning how to live with people that aren't your family. You're learning all these different kinds of things. You're learning other extracurriculars, like different kinds of sports that you just wanted to try out, or learning about different clubs, like learning photography or something like that. So you're learning much more than just the academics and getting that degree, which again, like, we need to think about what that means for non-traditional students, because oftentimes they know they're missing out on this. And I'm sure it must be very frustrating. It's going to be different if I get into this graduate program, because I've already had that experience. I'm not too worried about getting it again, being an online student. But for our undergraduate students, I feel like a lot of people have this idea about what college is supposed to be. And then depending on what your circumstances are, it's not going to play out like that.
Yeah.
So then how do you get that experience?
And I think you can probably do without that experience because you just had it
Right.
last year. When I think about a returning adult student, I mean, who's going to help that adult student navigate their midlife crisis? Like, luckily, I have you to help me navigate my midlife crisis. But no, to be serious, that there's a sense in which returning adult students also want to return to college to have some, like, essentially to return to that place of figuring out who they are, to return to that place of kind of navigating that. Other thoughts?
I don't know that my thoughts are coherent, because it strikes me a couple of things about credentialism. One is, I think we can reach students who feel that way, and I think you're both right. We need to recognize that students do often feel that way, because if you ask them, okay, well, if you gave me your $80,000 and we handed you a degree, would you be okay with that? Most students would say, well, no. I want to get something out of this particular degree. So I think that's the space where you work with them, right? To say, okay, well, yeah, then you're acknowledging that there's something about this process that it's important. It's not just paying for a piece of paper or a degree. But I also wonder if there's also a different middle ground where students, and even many of the students that we attract, don't care so much about the liberal arts, and also don't feel it's just a credential, but expect their education to train them how to do their job. And I think that's maybe the group of students that we have to speak to probably most significantly, to show them maybe there's more to it than that, but also that what we are teaching you is how to do your job, just maybe not exactly how you thought, what you thought that meant, right? And I think there's a larger world opening sense that Jess is talking about. That's part of that. So I just wanted to kind of address that middle ground.
Well, and just to say as well is to say students are coming here to get the credential and not understanding it. It's like, when would they learn that? I mean, it's certainly not, and that this is about the system and not individuals, but they're certainly not getting that love of learning from a K-12 system, right? They are being taught very clearly that the purpose of learning is testing. And you pass the test and you get the grades, and there are certain rewards. You get to still do your sports, you get to do your extracurriculars, you do really well in school because you're going to go to college, and you go to college because you're going to get a job. And that's, the actual level, if the parents can do it, great, but I mean, that's becoming increasingly difficult as well because of the dominant narratives. And so that's a real challenge. That's why I'm always thinking about that fear behind it, right? Like, what is this idea that we want the credential, we need the credential, teach me how to do my job. I mean, there's a real fear back there, but there's also, as you sort of said, that lack of knowledge. They're not getting the joy of learning, at least from school. They might be getting it from extracurriculars. They might be getting it from their hobbies. They might be getting it from making their homemade YouTube videos. They might even be getting it from playing video games because it's something they're actually invested in learning and getting joy from. But I bet you if you ask most students if they enjoyed learning in high school, you'll get crickets. And I've actually asked a lot of students. I've taught freshman writing for years, and I would almost always ask them that. And they said, what was your favorite part of high school? And it was either it ending or summer vacation, it ending, or if they were lucky enough, whatever extracurricular sport and or activity they did. I loved band, I loved AV club, I loved playing football, I loved, whatever it was we did afterwards. And that was the thing that they most loved about it. And so then that becomes the question is like, how do we tap into that? How do we get on that? Because they do love learning. They just don't love school learning because they don't understand what that is. Or at least they don't understand what it could be.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the things that Lee, you're talking about now, and Jess, you've talked about, are really some of the traditional virtues of college, residential college especially. And to me, that's something we've always been very, very good at. And I think we're at a very interesting place because over time, as an institution, we've developed a lot of cutting edge, leading approaches to technology and learning, but what we see going on in the broader landscape, and I would almost say many of you on this panel are much more experts at this than I am, but at bigger institutions where it has most often just been about scale and being able to, and that's good from an access point of view. You can touch rural communities, others who might not be able to get in. But I think one of the interesting challenges that we have from where we are right now is the question of how we can recreate some of that sense of community and some of that sense of learning as adventure with technology, scale up some so that, especially with adult populations, we can have an impact on a broader segment of our community. From my point of view, where I sit as provost, my goal isn't necessarily to bring this, all the way across the country and to international communities and so on. I would be happy if we found ways to serve a regional community where we have a strong reputation and we have a lot to offer that is kind of, I venture to say, better, more impactful than some of the choices that are available that are very convenient for adult learners especially. But we have this opportunity to bring some of the great advantages of this residential community to a broader population, and I think, as somebody suggested earlier, also have a little bit of back and forth. I think, Steve, you said it, a little bit of the interactivity between our traditional students, our adult students, our online learners, our primarily residential learners, in ways that could be very, very powerful. I think everything that I'm hearing from my point of view is great. The challenge for us is to mediate between that identity as a traditional college, but with all the great virtues of being a traditional college, which we do not want to lose touch with at all. Those are our core strengths for this institution. But at the same time, being able to adapt, to tap into technologies so that we can expand our audience, our student body in ways that are very exciting for us, but always staying in touch with those core virtues. Mm-hmm. So, that to me is a space that's in some ways still yet to be defined. I think we've kind of seen on a national scale some of the attempts to scale up that have fallen flat. And so others that have been successful, and students are getting degrees and good things are happening. But I think given our size, our location, our history, we have an opportunity to do something very interesting that might be a little bit different than what others have been able to do in bringing together liberal arts values and new technologies.
Yeah, I think a lot of large institutions, but I think the small institutions as well have tried to scale what I see as the lowest common denominator. They scale content delivery. And they can scale content delivery really well, but they honestly probably can't scale it as well as libraries can, or Wikipedia can, or the web can. And so I don't necessarily think scaling content is what a university should be trying to do. And it's interesting that the mic just got handed to Martha, because I was just about to quote my friend Martha Burtis, who writes, Courses have long been the way we have measured our institutions and the way we have organized our administrative processes. We understand ourselves and what we offer to students through the unit of the course. But I would argue that with the greater adoption of administrative systems in higher education, we doubled down on that unit of measure. And so what I wonder about is, as we think about scaling, what is it that we want to scale? Maybe it's not the course, maybe it's the sense of community that's created here. Maybe it's the sense of pride in the relationships that we develop during our time in college. So what is it? Just rethinking what it is that we want to scale.
So I was going to actually talk about something else, but I will just follow up with that somebody who used to work here at Mary Washington, Gardner Campbell, one of my favorite quotes, I won't get it right, but something that he used to say was that one of the things that we are really good at scaling in universities is people, that people scale in really, really remarkable ways that we don't fully understand and we often don't fully respect. That resources are limited always in one way or another, but people, when positioned properly and given opportunities, can scale in ways that we can't, are unimaginable. And I think that's really an important thing. And I think that's what we do as educators, is we help students to scale, right? Like to become bigger and better. But the thing that I wanted to say was that it seems to me in hearing people talk that there are two really big challenges. There are lots of challenges that face us, but there are two challenges I want to talk about, and one of them is a kind of a local challenge, and one of them isn't. And so we have the challenge of attracting students to Mary Washington, and how we do that, and what story we tell about ourselves, and how we understand ourselves, as well as how we tell that story. But that's happening against a backdrop. I'll just say national, although really it's bigger than that even. A national backdrop of conversation about the meaning of higher education that's beyond our control in some ways, and that I'll get on the soapbox that I've gotten on before, that I think we, not just Mary Washington, but we in higher education are fully to blame for, which is that for many years as residential liberal arts schools, we didn't have to fight for students. We knew what we did, and we knew we did it well, and we were in the position of selecting them. And so we didn't have to tell our story. We didn't have to frame that narrative. We didn't have to care about it. And that's changed for lots of different reasons. And we have continued to not want to tell our story and not take that narrative back. And as a result, we're seeing that narrative get told for us and that story get told for us. And then we get angry because we have politicians and pundits talking about higher education in ways that we think misrepresent what it is we're trying to do, and build up expectations and understandings, expectations among students who could come here and their parents about what education is for and what this place is for, that we think misrepresents what it is we're trying to do. But still, we don't talk about what it is we're doing. We don't challenge that in ways that are meaningful. And so I personally believe that there's actually an opportunity for a school like ours to meet both of these challenges. And the way that we do it is that we position ourselves as one of the schools that does talk about what we do, and that does share what this means, and that does tell a story about what that is. Like, does that change the national conversation? I don't know, and that's not really the point. But what it does do, at least for us, is helps us to solidify our understanding of who we are, and it helps us on the first front, which is how we attract students, by being really forthright with them about why a liberal arts education matters, what it means. We never talk to our students about what a liberal arts education is, and then we ask, why don't they value a liberal arts education? So that's a huge disconnect that I think we really have to address. So that's it. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, yeah, you just have to take a bunch of gen eds in random disciplines so you can graduate. Like 2 math classes, 2 science classes, whatever. And then if you're smart, you get them out of the way. If not, you leave them until senior year and regret everything as you're trying to do your thesis as well.
I saw a comment from one of my students very recently in our online discussion forum that was to the effect of, why do we take all these gen ed classes in college? Isn't that what we did in high school? And I think part of the disconnect there is not only in the mind that conflates liberal arts education with gen ed courses, but actually in those courses themselves, that the the point is not that we take classes in a bunch of different things, but that we learn how to connect and synthesize and make these connections and invent new things from them. And that's not always taking place in those courses, right? And that's something where, as we're designing and teaching those courses, I think we need to be very cognizant, and especially if we have non-traditional students who aren't on campus to make those connections accidentally with their friends in the dorms and in the dining hall, we've got to really build that into the courses so that the course itself becomes the branch out to those other disciplines, those other ways of thinking, and those other kinds of people that they wouldn't see or interact with otherwise.
And I think that we have to resist the tendency that we have to say, oh, but if we have to include that in our courses, then we won't have time for X or we won't have time for Y. Who cares? You have to give up X and Y if you actually want to, have people have the experience. If you want them to take in X, Y, or Z, you have to be willing to kind of let go a little bit.
And they're not always mutually exclusive. There are ways, there are plenty of situations where we can design an activity or a unit that will actually bring those together in a way that ends up being more time efficient, while reaching out to more things. Can I throw in one other thing that I think we talk about what the online course misses or what the non-traditional students miss out on because they don't have that in-person residential experience. But I think there's something that primarily 18 to 22-year-olds living in one place together miss, and that has to do with intergenerational interactions. They interact with each other and with their faculty members. It can often see them as authority figures, and then there's this power dynamic at play. But as soon as you bring in parents of young children, or even the faculty member brings their children to campus, I noticed this right away. All of a sudden, people are like covering their mouth when they swear in the hallways, just as a small thing. But then also some of my students babysat my kids, and they got to know them a little better, and seeing the kids around, it changes the attitude of what's going on when you interact with a parent as one of your classmates, or you can't just meet them at 10 p.m. tonight at the library to study something because they've already driven home and they're home for the night and their kids are in bed and they might be able to text you, right? That's where the digital starts to forge some of those new interactions that we can focus on. But ultimately, those non-traditional students are bringing something to the residential student experiences that they were missing in a traditional program that we can capitalize on, that adds to their social development, it adds to their ability to empathize, it adds to the diversity of the political spectrum that they interact with on a regular basis. And that's something, I think it's important not just to think that we have the gold standard and how can we apply that to more kinds of people who don't normally have access to that, but that there are things that we in the residential community can gain from interacting with people that don't normally have access to our community.
So a question I want to throw out to the room. A number of different things have come up, and I'm wondering, do we see certain things being barriers to us having this conversation about meeting the needs of non-traditional students, thinking about education as professional, thinking about the liberal arts and the digital? One of the things that I talked about, quoting Martha, was the course, that the course somehow gets in our way. Another thing that people often talk about is seat time, the notion of seat time as being even just that phrase, that somehow that phrase stops us from really thinking about education the way that we could if we didn't have that to think about. I'm wondering if there are other things that people want to put on the table, or any other remarks that people have about any of those things.
Well, I was actually, this isn't exactly what you're pointing out, but I was curious what people did think of Steve's comment about having, what if we did something fairly radical that didn't fit into a course scheduled time, like what if we had a mastery course where you just got the credit once you'd mastered all of the concepts? And demonstrated that, as opposed to this 14 weeks or 15 weeks or whatever. I was just curious about the likelihood of us being able to do something like that. Jonathan wants to
be a bit of a challenge for state and federal regulations, but pardon?
We couldn't do it at all.
There would be ways to do it, but it'd be a bit of a challenge. I was actually thinking while Steve was talking on the issue that you mentioned that we actually do have some differentiation within the semesters. Of course, we have 8-week courses. Actually, summer courses, of course, are not 16 weeks or even 8 weeks, most of them. We have courses that meet once a week and so forth. So there are ways around it, including, hybrid courses and so forth that don't always meet. But I wanted to pick up on something, a point it was a long time ago, so I'm not sure I remember it correctly, but a point that Jonathan was making earlier about really trying to integrate or connect our really strong liberal arts community-oriented tradition with new modalities for attracting new students. I think we're particularly well positioned to do that, or will be, given the President Peno's, I think, quite wise goal of reviving the Stafford campus. In some respects, we've already seen it with the nursing program, as some of you are well aware, where we have courses that are completely online. We have courses that are hybrid, but we also have courses that are in person and that mix traditional age students who are not nursing students with, students who are much older who've got lots of experience, and that, I think, to your point earlier, is really a great thing, because it's not just that they see older people as people, but younger students learn a great deal from the wisdom of experience. But I also, but getting back to my point, I think we are uniquely positioned as the Stafford campus regrows, in part for two reasons. One, Stafford's not that far away, and it's not that far away. It's not a whole lot closer to Route 95 than we are here on the main campus. And so we already have students who are perfectly happy to come here, perfectly happy to go out to Stafford at night. And so again, that provides opportunities for both traditional age students and non-traditional students to mix, but also for us to use different modalities in different places. But second, there's a lot of, and this is a point that hasn't been made yet, there's a lot of ambivalence among non-traditional age students, which I'm aware of because I work with the BLS program, and I've worked especially closely with the nursing program. On the one hand, we've observed that nursing students will actually turn down $5,000 a year from the hospital that they can use towards tuition here because they want a fully online program that they'll pay a lot more for. In fact, one of the for-profits, which just really speaks to how important just convenience is, even if we hold the courses at night, even if the courses are hybrid. But on the other hand, I know from talking to deans of nursing elsewhere, as well as our director here, that the comment most repeated on course evaluations for online courses is, wish I had more contact, wish I had more in-person contact, which really gets at an ambivalence. They don't want the course if it has in-person contact, but they really long for it. Anyhow, that brings me back to my central point. I think given the location of the Stafford campus and our ambitions, and really the very varied kind of pedagogies that we use, including all that you guys promote, I do think we are uniquely well positioned to develop in those directions and really attract those ambivalent students.
I have two ideas that I think we should totally try here. No, because it's like a nice happy balance between the radical and the traditional, what we've been doing. So the first one, I think, which would be a really cool experiment and to just get some feedback for students that actually are on campus and potentially then in the future online students, have a class where you can show up in person, but you can also take it online. And you can go to a couple classes online, a couple classes in face, see which students tend to like which method, see if students end up staying more online or coming to class because maybe they didn't like the online or maybe they thought that online was much more convenient, and then see what their differences were and see how they felt about taking the two, and maybe making a requirement that everyone has to show up in person at least once and everyone has to take it online at least once. So kind of having like a very, very hybrid class, I think would be really interesting. And then another thing, though, about the online students not having enough contact is, so if we look at least at like commuter students that are taking online classes, if they're commuting for other classes but taking a certain one online, it must mean that they're pretty close or close enough to come to campus. So maybe instead of just letting it be fully online, have a couple of introductory videos that people probably don't watch and things like that, which, I mean, come on, it's true. But instead having like a weekly meetup or every other week or even a monthly meetup in person. And it doesn't even have to be super formal, like maybe have a discussion over dinner. So that way it's still kind of practical. Like everyone's meeting up, you're eating dinner, everyone finds a convenient time. Or even like lunch, something like that. I think that would be a really good way to start connecting in person, but also, keeping that convenience of the online.
Can I just throw in one quick thought? And this is actually going to sound like a brag, and I don't mean it that way at all. But I've gotten comments on a couple of my online courses from students that said they were surprised at how much they got to know me or their classmates, given that it was completely online. It felt much more personal than they expected. And that just comes from taking some time to design that into the way the course works. And it can be done. And it can be done without that much, bending over backwards to make it happen. If it's part of your objective in designing the course, you can make a course where people say, I expected it to be just me sitting there doing some work, turning it in, getting my credential and my education from it. But it turned out that I really got to know people and learned from them in ways I didn't expect. Like that's totally possible to do.
We set up a dichotomy between online and in person. Why can't in person be online? Why can't we have? I mean, it's a perfect example. My relationship to you. I knew you online, but it never felt like anything but in person for many years.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think it speaks to our effort to recreate that sense of community in everything that we do, and I love that kind of notion that we all operate on this kind of dichotomy where the tendency is to think online is going to be one thing and it's going to be very impersonal, and in person is going to be the opposite. We all know we have students who sit in the back of our classrooms and it's completely impersonal to them face to face. So I think one of the things we should be striving to do all the time is to break that down and create that sense of community in everything that we do. And I just want to echo what Martha said earlier too. And a lot of people have about selling this thing that we do a little bit more openly and aggressively. And one of the themes that I've heard a lot here today is connecting, and that word connecting has been used, whether it's connecting with students and creating a relationship with them, or connecting different parts of the curriculum and helping students understand how it all hangs together in some way. And I was reminded of an essay that William Cronin wrote years ago called Only Connect, using that from the Forster novel. And it's one of the best short defenses of the liberal arts that I've ever read. And I think one of the things we need to find more ways to do is to talk more explicitly with students and with prospective students, so that we make sure the prospective students know who we are and that we're attracting the prospective students who embrace the model of education that we represent. But to talk more explicit and to guide them through some of the core texts, not long ones, not overly complicated, but deep ones and profound ones that help them think about connections across the curriculum and the beauty and wonder of taking the math class and taking the English class and being incapable of not seeing the relationship between what you're learning in both of these, or between a technologically mediated class, or maybe a component of an in-person class, face-to-face class, and the more physical, direct one, face-to-face experience. I think the more we can do to make all of that explicit, the better for our students, but also, just as importantly, for ourselves, because I think we struggle a little bit sometimes with that identity question, and I know this is an endless topic of conversation on campus, and I sometimes feel like the answer is right in front of us, but we just have a hard time seeing it. I think some of the answer to that is in the attempt to bring things together for our students. And I just think that needs to be foregrounded in everything that we do. And we need to develop a more explicit vocabulary for our students and for ourselves that speaks to that value.
So I'm going to let you have the last word because we're officially out of time. I'm going to hang out. I'm sure some of the panelists will hang out and chat. I want to make 2 announcements before we say goodbye, and they are that on Wednesday of next week at 4 p.m., if you're interested in playing around with hypothesis and delving into some of these discussions a little more deeply, Lee will be leading a session on hypothesis in the incubator classroom upstairs, Wednesday, 4 p.m. And then the next one of these will be on November 1st, right here, 4 p.m. We have 4 folks that are coming to visit from outside the institution, an international group. We've got Kate Bowles, who's coming from Australia. We have Alan Levine and Sean Michael Morris and Liz Losh, who will all be with us to talk about ethical online learning. So spread the word. Gather more people. And thank you all. I'm going to give you all a round of applause. Thanks for your help.